A computer screen flickers inside the Egypt Ministry of Antiquities DNA lab. On it appear the genetic results of the world's most famous mummy, King Tutankhamun. Within minutes, the data is sealed. Officials rush in, phone calls are made, and the results are stamped with a single phrase: national security. Why would the DNA of a pharaoh who died 3,000 years ago be treated like a military secret? Because what those scientists uncovered wasn't the story of a golden boy who ruled Egypt in glory. It was the story of a genetic nightmare, of a dynasty so obsessed with divine blood, they married brother to sister until their children were born broken. And the boy at the center of it all? Tutankhamun. Crippled by disease, dependent on walking sticks, a god king who could barely walk across his own palace. But that wasn't the part Egypt feared most. The real danger lay in what the DNA suggested about Tut's ancestry, and the modern cover-up that followed. Let me take you to modern-day Cairo, February 2010, where this mystery unfolds. A geneticist stares at a glowing computer screen deep inside Egypt's DNA lab. The results don't make sense, at least not at first. The alleles line up, one after another, too close, too perfect. And then it hits him. King Tutankhamun was the child of brother and sister. He doesn't say a word. Neither does his colleague across the room. 10 minutes pass in silence. The air feels heavier. They both know what this means. Egypt's golden boy, the pharaoh who became a global icon after Howard Carter unearthed his tomb in 1922, was not the divine ruler generations had imagined. He was the genetic product of incest, a boy already broken the moment he was born. The scientist reaches for the phone. No answer. He tries to email the results to his team. The internet cuts out. Hours later, when he finally gets through to the Ministry of Antiquities, the reply is ice cold. Those results are classified. From this moment, you will not discuss them outside this project. Think about that. DNA from a boy who died 3,000 years ago has just been declared a matter of national security. Why? Because the test didn't just expose incest, it revealed the collapse of an entire dynasty. A family tree twisted into a genetic horror story that ended with Tutankhamun, a frail teenager crippled by disease, unable to walk without a cane. Those 130 walking sticks found in his tomb, they weren't symbols of authority. They were medical devices. Picture this. You're meant to be a living god, commander of armies, ruler of the world's greatest empire. But every step you take is agony. Your spine curves, your bones rot, your immune system betrays you. Priests whisper, advisors scheme, enemies watch, and everyone can see the truth. The god king is weak. That was Tutankhamun's reality. But here's the part that shook Egypt's leaders to the core. Tut wasn't an exception. He was the inevitable result of a dynasty that had been destroying itself for generations. And if the full truth came out, it wouldn't just rewrite history. It could destabilize national identity, cost billions in tourism, and hand fuel to extremists eager to weaponize Tut's DNA. So, the cover-up began. International scientists promised access to Tut's DNA were suddenly locked out. Permits revoked. Calls unanswered. Even the lead researcher admitted later, "I had a very difficult time gaining access to the mummy again. It was hard to verify my work." And when a Swiss genetic company leaked their own analysis, claiming Tutankhamun's genetic markers were more common in Western Europeans than modern Egyptians, the reaction was immediate. Brutal. Legal threats. Political pressure. Data scrubbed from the record. Why? What secret could be so dangerous that modern Egypt would risk its reputation to keep it hidden? The answer lies in the DNA data still glowing on laboratory screens. Because those genetic markers tell a story that begins 2 generations before Tutankhamun was even born. A story of a pharaoh whose thirst for power pushed him into a decision that would doom his children, his grandchildren, and his entire bloodline. A decision so unthinkable, even his priests hesitated to record it. But DNA doesn't lie. And what it revealed about Tutankhamun's grandfather was just the beginning of the horror. The laboratory data scrolls across the screen one more time. The evidence is undeniable. But to understand how this tragedy began, we need to go back in the family tree, back to where the genetic catastrophe first took root. Egypt, 14th century BCE. Amenhotep III was the most powerful man alive. Gold poured in from Nubia. Tribute flowed from Syria. Kings begged for his friendship. To the world, he was a living god. But for Amenhotep, power wasn't enough. He wanted his bloodline to be more than royal. He wanted it to be divine, untouchable, eternal. So he made a decision that would curse his descendants forever, a decision whose consequences now glow in chromosomal data on computer screens. Amenhotep married his daughters, not distant cousins, not ceremonial unions, his own flesh and blood. Sitamun, Iset, girls raised in the palace now forced into marriages with their father. Picture the wedding day. Priests chanting hymns to the gods, nobles cheering, and in the middle of it all, a daughter walking down the aisle to her own father, knowing she couldn't say no. This wasn't just ritual. Children were born of these unions. Children who carried the same damaged DNA twice over. Children whose genetic markers scientists can now trace through the bloodline like a spreading poison. One of those children was Akhenaten, who would later become Tutankhamun's father. But the genetic analysis reveals that Akhenaten didn't learn from his father's sins. He doubled down on them. When he became pharaoh, Akhenaten married his sister. The genetic damage that had already begun with Amenhotep now compounded into something catastrophic. Think about what this means. Akhenaten was the product of father-daughter incest. Then he had a child with his sister, Tutankhamun. The DNA sequence shows the mathematical certainty. The odds of producing a healthy heir were virtually zero. Tutankhamun was doomed from the moment of conception. And his mother, we don't even know her name. History erased her so completely that she is remembered only as the younger lady. Scientists have her DNA too, chromosomes that tell the story of a woman who carried the weight of generations of genetic sin in her womb. When Tutankhamun was born, the horror was visible. His foot twisted, his spine bent, his head elongated. Servants whispered, "This was not a god king. This was a broken child." But it went deeper than appearances. The genetic markers reveal immune system deficiencies, bone fragility, reproductive dysfunction. His bloodline was so corrupted that his body became a prison. And Tutankhamun was not the only one. DNA analysis shows that nearly every royal child of this dynasty carried deformities, weaknesses, or died before adulthood. Stillbirths, miscarriages, infant coffins buried in silence. This was not divine blood. This was poison. And here's the most chilling part. The Egyptians knew. Medical papyri from the time mention birth defects. They understood that close blood unions carried risks. Yet the dynasty kept going, convinced purity was worth more than survival. Why? Because behind the throne stood a woman who shaped the empire more than any pharaoh. A queen who rose from common birth to become the most powerful female figure Egypt had ever seen. Her name was Tiye, Tutankhamun's grandmother. And as scientists stare at her perfectly preserved DNA, they realize the most disturbing truth of all. She was the architect of the genetic nightmare. The puppet master who orchestrated generations of incest, while her own genetic material became the foundation for a dynasty's destruction. But Tia's story and her grandson Akhenaten's desperate response to the family's genetic crisis was about to take an even darker turn. If you're starting to realize how much hidden history is still being covered up today, make sure you subscribe, because this conspiracy goes deeper than anyone imagined. Back in Cairo, scientists clicked to another file, Akhenaten's mummy, KV55. And what the DNA reveals about Tutankhamun's father is perhaps the most shocking discovery of all. Because Akhenaten wasn't just dealing with his family's genetic curse, He was using it to justify the most radical revolution in ancient history. Akhenaten inherited not just a throne, but broken blood. His body carried the genetic scars scientists can now read like a medical chart. Weak, frail, vulnerable. He knew his enemies could see it. He knew the priests whispered behind his back. And so, he made a decision as radical as his father's, but in a different way. If he could not appear strong, he would redefine what strength meant. He abandoned 1,000 years of gods and declared a new order. There was only one god, Aten, the sun disk, and only Akhenaten could speak to him. Picture the moment. The pharaoh stands before his court. Behind him, the blazing sun. In front of him, the most powerful priesthood in Egypt. He declares their gods dead, their temples meaningless, their power erased in an instant. The reaction was fury. The priests of Amun had ruled Egypt's spiritual life for centuries. They owned land, wealth, armies of workers. And now, with a single decree, Akhenaten had stripped it all away. But why risk everything? Why challenge the most powerful force in the kingdom? The genetic data provides a clue. Because Akhenaten needed to reshape reality itself. The art from his reign shows him with wide hips, narrow shoulders, a swollen belly, even breasts. For decades, scholars thought he suffered from genetic disorders, but DNA analysis tells a different story. There was nothing wrong with his body. The deformities were propaganda. He wanted his people to see him as neither fully man nor woman, but a living image of Aten, the god without gender. His family's genetic weaknesses weren't flaws, he insisted. They were divine. It was genius and madness. He even built a new capital, Amarna, a city carved out of desert, dedicated entirely to Aten. Thousands were forced to leave their homes and march into the sands to build his vision. But Amarna was a disaster. The location was barren. The buildings crumbled. The people starved. And while Akhenaten obsessed over his sun temples, Egypt's enemies saw opportunity. Letters from this period show foreign kings begging for help as their lands were attacked. But Akhenaten ignored them. His god was more important than his empire. At his side stood Nefertiti, his queen. Unlike any woman before her, she wielded pharaonic power, shown in carvings striking enemies, leading rituals, commanding as his equal. Some believe that after Akhenaten's death, she even ruled in disguise as a mysterious male pharaoh called Smenkhkare, but the genetic truth was unavoidable. Research data shows that the children of Akhenaten and Nefertiti died young or were born with severe deformities. His sister wife gave birth to Tutankhamun, a boy whose DNA profile shows he was already crippled at birth. When Akhenaten finally died around 1336 BCE, Egypt was in chaos. The empire weakened, its enemies circling, its gods abandoned, and its heir was a sickly child who could barely stand. The establishment had had enough. The priests, the generals, the courtiers, they were waiting, and soon they would erase Akhenaten's revolution from history. But first, they had to deal with the boy king, Tutankhamun, the child whose genetic profile now appears on laboratory monitors with growing horror. A boy who would inherit not just an empire in crisis, but a body so broken that every day of his life would be agony. And as scientists prepare to analyze the most heartbreaking data of all, the stillborn fetuses found in Tutankhamun's tomb, they realize they're about to uncover evidence of a tragedy so profound that it would explain why Egypt is so desperate to keep these secrets buried. Scientists hesitate before opening the next file, the genetic analysis of the two mummified fetuses found in Tutankhamun's tomb. They know what they're about to see will be devastating, but they click anyway. The data loads, and it's worse than imagined. Let's go back to where it all began for Tutankhamun. He became pharaoh at age 9. Think about that for a moment. A 9-year-old boy, already showing signs of the genetic damage scientists can now map in precise detail. suddenly responsible for governing the largest empire on Earth. And he was completely, utterly unprepared for it. Picture the coronation ceremony. The golden crown is placed on the head of a child who needs walking sticks just to stand upright. The priests chant about divine authority while everyone can see that this god king can barely speak clearly because of his cleft palate. The boy is trying so hard to look strong, to project the royal authority his advisors keep telling him he possesses. But every step is agony. His clubfoot makes walking painful. His spinal curvature affects his posture. And everyone in that room knows, absolutely knows, that this child cannot lead Egypt. So other people stepped in to run the empire. Possibly Tutankhamun's great-uncle, became the real power behind the throne. General Horemheb controlled the military. The priests of Amun, who had been suppressed during Akhenaten's revolution, saw their chance to regain control. And Tutankhamun, he became a puppet. Imagine being that boy. You're told you're a god, but you can't walk without help. You're supposed to lead armies, but you can barely make it across a room. You're meant to project divine power, but everyone treats you like a sick child who needs constant supervision. The psychological damage must have been devastating, but the worst pressure came from the one thing that mattered most in ancient Egypt: producing an heir. When Tutankhamun reached adolescence, his advisors arranged his marriage to Ankhesenamun, his half-sister. Yes, another sister. Because apparently this family had learned absolutely nothing from generations of genetic disasters. The wedding night must have been a nightmare. Two teenagers, both carrying damaged DNA, both under enormous pressure to produce the next pharaoh. Both knowing, deep down, that their children would likely inherit the same genetic problems that plagued their family. And then came the pregnancies. Laboratory data from the fetuses tells the whole story. The first pregnancy ended in miscarriage. The second pregnancy produced a baby girl who died shortly after birth. The babies were so genetically damaged they couldn't survive. The third pregnancy ended with a stillborn daughter. Chromosomal abnormalities so severe that normal development was impossible. Each failed pregnancy was seen as evidence that the gods had withdrawn their favor from the royal family. Each dead baby was a political crisis. Each miscarriage brought the dynasty closer to extinction. Imagine being Ankhesenamun, going through pregnancy after pregnancy, knowing that your damaged genetics were killing your children before they could even live. The guilt, the shame, the desperate hope that maybe this time would be different. And imagine being Tutankhamun, watching his wife suffer through these failed pregnancies, knowing that his own genetic damage was partially responsible for their children's deaths. The political implications were catastrophic. Without an heir, the royal line would die out. The carefully constructed system of divine kingship would collapse. Egypt's enemies would see the succession crisis as an opportunity to invade. So Tutankhamun tried harder. More pregnancies, more miscarriages, more dead babies. The mummified fetuses found in his tomb tell the whole story. These weren't just sad reminders of infant mortality. They were evidence of a genetic catastrophe so severe that viable human life was nearly impossible. And through all of this, Tutankhamun's own health was deteriorating. DNA analysis shows the bone disease was getting worse, literally eating away at his tissue while he was still alive. The malaria infections kept recurring because his compromised immune system couldn't fight them off. The clubfoot made every step more painful. He was dying slowly, watching his body fail him piece by piece, while the empire around him crumbled. The boy who was supposed to be a god had become a living reminder of what happens when power corrupts family completely. But when Tutankhamun finally died at age 19 without a living heir, he triggered a succession crisis that would expose the most shocking cover-up in ancient history. A cover-up that involved desperate queens, foreign princes, and political murders that make modern conspiracy theories look tame. And scientists, still staring at the genetic evidence, are beginning to understand why Egyptian authorities are so desperate to keep this data classified. Because what happened next would prove that sometimes the truth is too dangerous for the world to know. Scientists scroll to the final section of their analysis. DNA from a mummy, known only as the Younger Lady, believed to be Ankhesenamun, Tutankhamun's widow. Her genetic profile tells a story of survival against impossible odds, and of a decision so desperate it would seal the dynasty's fate forever. When Tutankhamun died, his widow did something unprecedented in Egyptian history. Something so shocking, so desperate, that it reveals just how completely the royal bloodline had collapsed. Ankhesenamun, barely 20 years old and now a widow, wrote a letter to Egypt's greatest enemy, the Hittite Empire. Her message was simple and heartbreaking. "My husband is dead and I have no son. Send me one of your princes to marry me and become pharaoh of Egypt." Think about what this means. The widow of an Egyptian pharaoh was so desperate to avoid the complete collapse of her family's dynasty that she was willing to hand the throne of Egypt to a foreign prince. But here's what makes this even more shocking. She had to do it in secret, because if the Egyptian court found out, they would kill her. Picture Ankhesenamun, alone in her chambers, writing this treasonous letter by candlelight. Her hands are shaking. She knows that what she's doing could be considered the ultimate betrayal. But she also knows that without an heir, without any viable option to continue the bloodline, Egypt will descend into civil war. The letter made it to Suppiluliuma I, the Hittite king. His reaction tells us everything we need to know about how desperate Ankhesenamun's situation was. Even the Hittites were shocked. Suppiluliuma couldn't believe that Egypt's queen would make such an offer. He sent messengers back to confirm that this wasn't some kind of trap. "Why should I believe that the Egyptian queen would really marry my son?" he asked. Ankhesenamun's reply was even more heartbreaking. "I would never take a servant of mine and make him my husband. I am afraid. Come quickly with your son." She was afraid. A 20-year-old widow, surrounded by advisors who might kill her for treason, desperately trying to save a dynasty that had destroyed itself through generations of incest. But she was too late. The Egyptian establishment had figured out what she was doing. When the Hittite prince finally arrived in Egypt, he never made it to the palace. He was murdered on the journey, almost certainly by Egyptian officials who refused to allow foreign rule. And Ankhesenamun? The DNA evidence suggests she disappeared from historical records shortly after. Most historians believe she was killed to prevent her from making similar arrangements with other foreign powers. Think about that. A 20-year-old girl who had already suffered through multiple miscarriages and watched her disabled husband die was murdered by her own people for trying to save the dynasty. But the tragedy doesn't end there. With Tutankhamun dead and Ankhesenamun eliminated, the throne passed to I, the elderly advisor who had been running things behind the scenes. But I was old and had no legitimate claim to divine kingship. When I died 4 years later, General Horemheb seized power and began the systematic erasure of the entire family. This wasn't just political revenge. This was an attempt to literally delete the most genetically damaged dynasty in human history from existence. Horemheb ordered the destruction of Akhenaten's capital city. The stones were carted away and used for other building projects. Temples dedicated to Aten were demolished. Statues of the royal family were defaced or destroyed. Official king lists were rewritten to omit Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and their immediate successors. As far as Egyptian propaganda was concerned, these pharaohs had never existed. But the most telling evidence of how completely the dynasty had collapsed was Tutankhamun's burial. Remember, this was supposed to be a god king. Egyptian pharaohs were traditionally buried in massive pyramids or elaborate tombs carved into the Valley of the Kings. They were mummified with incredible care and buried with treasures that would sustain them in the afterlife. Tutankhamun got a hastily prepared tomb that wasn't even designed for royal use. Many of his grave goods were recycled from other sources. Items originally made for other family members were quickly reinscribed with his name. The mummification process was rushed and poorly done. His body was actually burned during the embalming process because of chemical mistakes. This wasn't the burial of a beloved pharaoh. This was the embarrassed disposal of a genetic disaster that the establishment wanted to forget as quickly as possible. But here's the ultimate irony. The hasty burial that was meant to erase Tutankhamun from history is exactly what made him famous. Because his tomb was so small and insignificant, grave robbers overlooked it. When Howard Carter discovered it in 1922, it was nearly intact, the only royal Egyptian tomb to survive with most of its treasures. The golden mask that made Tutankhamun the most famous pharaoh in the world was created to hide the most shameful royal family secret in ancient history. And for over a century, it worked. Until DNA analysis finally revealed the truth. But that's when the modern cover-up began. And scientists, still staring at the genetic evidence that tells this entire tragic story, are about to discover that some secrets are too dangerous for the modern world to handle. Scientists save their files and reach for phones to call supervisors. The genetic evidence is clear, compelling, and absolutely devastating. The world needs to know the truth about Tutankhamun. But as they start to dial, phones ring first. This is the Ministry of Tourism. We need to talk. That phone call changed everything. Within 48 hours, complete DNA data was classified. International scientists who had been working on the project were suddenly denied access. The laboratory where the research was conducted was placed under new security protocols. And the researchers, they were told to never discuss the full implications of their findings with anyone outside the project team. Think about what happened here. The Egyptian government took scientific evidence about a pharaoh who died over 3,000 years ago and treated it like a state secret. Why? Because Egypt makes over $13 billion per year from tourism, and King Tutankhamun is one of their biggest attractions. Imagine you're running Egypt's tourism ministry. Your entire marketing strategy is built around the romantic story of ancient Egyptian greatness. Millions of people visit your museums to see treasures from the golden age of the pharaohs. Your national identity is tied to being the heirs of one of history's greatest civilizations. Now imagine scientists prove that your most famous pharaoh was actually a disabled victim of extreme incest whose family destroyed itself through genetic manipulation. How do you spin that for the tourists? You don't. You bury it. The suppression was immediate and systematic. Remember that Swiss genetic company that analyzed leaked data from the DNA testing? They announced that Tutankhamun's genetic markers were more common in Western Europeans than modern Egyptians. The racial implications were explosive. If ancient Egypt's most famous pharaoh had genetic markers suggesting non-African ancestry, it would fuel centuries of racist theories about who really built Egyptian civilization. Egyptian officials didn't just request that the company remove their analysis. They allegedly threatened legal action and loss of access to future archaeological projects. Within months, detailed findings had been scrubbed from public view. But laboratory files tell a different story. Hidden on computer hard drives, protected by passwords and encryption, the complete genetic data remains. And it reveals something even more disturbing than incest or racial controversy, because the DNA doesn't just show what happened to Tutankhamun's family. It shows a pattern that extends to other royal dynasties, other genetic disasters, other cover-ups that are still being maintained. International scientists report that access to royal mummies has become increasingly restricted since the discoveries. Research proposals that might challenge official narratives about ancient Egyptian history face bureaucratic obstacles that can take years to overcome. Dr. Joanne Fletcher, a respected Egyptologist, describes a system where research that might challenge established narratives faces bureaucratic obstacles that can take years to overcome. Multiple international research teams have reported similar experiences. Initial approval followed by mysterious permit revocations, unanswered emails, and blocked access to materials that had previously been available. The pattern suggests a deliberate policy of controlling information that could damage Egypt's carefully constructed historical brand. But here's what makes this cover-up truly disturbing. It's still happening. Right now, as you're watching this, There are scientists who have seen complete DNA data but are not allowed to discuss it publicly. There are genetic findings that have been classified as matters of national security. There are international research projects being blocked because they might uncover more uncomfortable truths about ancient Egyptian royal families. The boy king, who died 3,000 years ago, is still being manipulated by people in power, still being used as a political tool, still having his true story suppressed to protect modern interests. Scientists know this. As they sit in laboratories looking at genetic evidence that could rewrite history, they understand that they're not just researchers anymore. They've become part of a conspiracy. And the weight of that knowledge, the responsibility of carrying these secrets, is something that will haunt them for the rest of their careers. But DNA doesn't lie. And slowly, inevitably, the truth is emerging. The genetic evidence is out there, scattered across encrypted files and the testimonies of researchers who've seen glimpses of the data. The comfortable myths about divine pharaohs and glorious bloodlines are crumbling under the weight of scientific evidence. And there's nothing the Egyptian authorities can do to stop it, because you can suppress scientists, but you can't suppress science. You can classify genetic data, but you can't change DNA. You can control access to mummies, but you can't control the truth. The boy behind the golden mask is finally telling his real story through the language of genetics. And it's more shocking than any lie they ever told about him. If you want to know about other historical cover-ups that are still happening today, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell, because this is just the beginning of what modern science is revealing about the past. Laboratory computers shut down. Files are encrypted, data hidden, truth buried under layers of classification and bureaucracy. But scientists know what they've seen, and they know it changes everything. The most famous pharaoh in history wasn't a god king. He was a disabled teenager born from brother-sister incest, crippled by genetic diseases, unable to walk without assistance, and doomed to die young without producing a viable heir. The golden mask that made him immortal was designed to hide the most shameful family secret in ancient history. And the people who discovered the truth, they were silenced, blocked, and threatened by modern authorities who care more about tourist dollars than historical accuracy. The story of King Tutankhamun teaches us something profound about power, truth, and human nature. It shows us what happens when families become so obsessed with purity that they destroy themselves from within. It reveals how the pursuit of absolute power can corrupt even the most basic human relationships. And it demonstrates how modern authorities will go to extraordinary lengths to protect comfortable lies from uncomfortable truths. 3,000 years after his death, Tutankhamun is still being manipulated by people who want to use his image for their own purposes. But DNA science has finally given us the tools to see through millennia of propaganda and myth-making. The genetic evidence doesn't care about tourism revenue, national pride, or political convenience. It only cares about facts. And the facts about King Tutankhamun are more tragic, more human, and more important than any golden legend ever created about him. His story is a warning about what happens when power becomes more important than people, when bloodlines become more important than human welfare, when myths become more important than truth. The boy king couldn't escape the genetic prison his family created for him. But his DNA has escaped the golden prison they built around his memory. And it's telling us a story that's more powerful than any pharaoh, more enduring than any dynasty, and more important than any treasure. The truth. Scientists know this truth, and somewhere in encrypted files and hidden data, that truth is waiting. Waiting for the day when the cover-up finally crumbles. Waiting for the day when genetic evidence can speak freely. Waiting for the day when the boy behind the golden mask can finally tell his real story to the world. But here's what Egypt's authorities didn't count on. Truth has a way of surviving, even when buried under tons of propaganda and political pressure. The revolution in genetic science is unstoppable. Every new discovery, every advancement in DNA analysis, every international collaboration between scientists brings us closer to exposing the full extent of what happened to royal bloodlines across ancient civilizations. This isn't just about one pharaoh or one dynasty. This is about rewriting human history itself. The boy king's DNA has spoken its truth. The only question left is, how much longer can they keep the rest of the evidence buried? And when the full genetic analysis finally sees the light of day, the world will never look at ancient power the same way again. The revolution has already begun. The truth is already spreading, and no amount of government classification can stop what's coming next. The boy who couldn't be king has become the key to unlocking the greatest historical conspiracy of our time. And his story is just the beginning.